All right, we have started recording, and I'll just keep muting folks as they come in. Thank you all for joining us for the final workshop in our series on storage webinars with Sandia National Labs for the Maryland Public Service Commission. We have two really interesting topics today, resilience and non-wires alternatives. And then at the end, we're going to hear a little bit from Dr. Zook, who has helped make all of this possible. So with that, I'm going to pass the floor over to Howard Passell, and we'll go from there. We will try to do a 10-minute break in between the two presentations, just like normal, and I'll let everybody know what time to come back when we get there. All right, thanks. Howard, it's all yours.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, Dr. Zook, for making all of this possible, and thanks to everybody at the Public Service Commission for tuning in across these sessions. You know, what a learning curve we've all been on for the last, month or so, and getting these workshops going remotely has been part of that learning curve. And we'll see, hopefully things will go smoothly today, but it seems like we finally got it worked out. So we should do 4 more of these things now that we've got all the bugs worked out of the system. So I'm gonna take myself off video here to reduce bandwidth issues. So I just wanted to say hello to everybody and let you all see my face briefly. And okay, that's that. All right, so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you all today about energy storage and resilience, which is the way energy storage can help meet resilience goals. And then another topic, the resilience of energy storage. I'm calling it the resilience of energy storage, but it's about the potential bottlenecks and shortcomings in energy storage that we still need to overcome in order to get energy storage to do everything we need it to do. So I want to talk a little bit about resilience. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about resilience since it's such a hot topic now, and we're going to be talking about it all day long, or all for the hour. So some of this is very conceptual, but I'll go through it very quickly. Maybe put us all on the same page to some extent. Now, I have this idea that all complex adaptive systems in the world, in the universe, oscillate. So on the left we have system on the y-axis we have system performance, on the x-axis we have time, and complex adaptive systems all very naturally oscillate over time, like resource systems, economic systems, social systems. The grid oscillates over very narrow boundaries, but still it oscillates. And this is a resilient system. This picture you see is a resilient system. This is a system that can oscillate within certain boundaries and not break. And so that's an example of a resilient system. Now we hate it. We hate the fact that these systems oscillate, and we want to knock off the peaks and knock off the troughs. We want to dampen all of these oscillations. So if this was a river system, for example, which is an area I worked in for 15 years, so the Rio Grande runs through the middle of New Mexico and through Albuquerque, and we have levees on the sides of the rivers to keep the river from overflowing when the oscillations are at the top, and we have reservoirs to store water when the oscillations are at the bottom. That is, when there's a drought, we store water. In the summertime, we store water. In the springtime, we try to prevent the upper oscillations, and we do that with everything. We want to do that with everything, but it's a challenge, and we try to do it with the grid too. Sustainability used to be the catchphrase. Now it's resilience, and I think the two are really flip sides of the same coin. You can't have a sustainable system without a resilient system. If the system isn't resilient, then it breaks, and it's not sustainable. This is what we want engineered systems to do. We want no oscillations in them. Of course, they oscillate anyway, and that's a perturbation, a challenge for all of us to deal with those engineered systems when they do oscillate off of this straight line. This is not resilient. I hope you're staying with me. We're on slide 6. This ever-increasing performance demand is not sustainable, not resilient, and I think we're seeing this now with the coronavirus. This line doesn't represent the way the coronavirus has behaved. The coronavirus has been exponential, and it has, you could argue, it has broken the public health system. It has broken the economic system. Now, that leads me to suggest that resilience is relative. In other words, we presume that the public health system is going to recover and the economic system is going to recover. So it isn't completely broken, but this is a picture of what happens when a system is not resilient. It crashes, it breaks. The only one of these examples on the right that I think is absolute is species extinction. Once a species goes extinct, that's that. But with regard to most of these other examples, they're relative. They will, they may recover, but we don't want these crashes to occur. We don't want these things to break. So our effort in resilience is to keep systems from breaking so that they can continue to provide services for all of us. And so what? Why is any of this useful or important? In my mind, it's useful to anticipate oscillations. We know they're going to happen. We know they're coming. We should anticipate them. We should try to anticipate the potential rates of change at all the different scales, local scales, regional scales, and so on. We should be working to formulate long and short-term strategies to deal with the oscillations and keep refining them. Adaptive management is a term that comes from my original field, which is ecology. That is, the adaptive management of resource systems requires you to make a plan and watch and observe how the plan actually works, and then adapt the plan and just keep on doing that in an iterative way forever as a way of trying to keep up with these very dynamic, complex adaptive systems. We want to manage peaks and troughs. We want to dampen those oscillations. We want to evaluate the costs associated with the oscillations and creating, dampening the oscillations. We should eschew constant or exponential increase because that will break system pretty quickly. And finally, and this is something I'll come back to at the very end today, we should be anticipating the unintended consequences of all of these oscillations and our efforts to remove them. So I'm going to talk about the formalism of looking at resilience with regards to electricity and communities for a few slides here. Electric power is obviously the key, arguably the keystone to effective communities, delivery of all of these other services, telecommunications, public health, public safety, transportation, and so on. Imagine how difficult things would be in New York City right now if electric power went down for a few hours or a few days. It would really magnify the disaster that's unfolding there. So maintaining electric power is important for everybody. Sandia has been involved in risk management for a long time. Sandia is a national security laboratory. It's a nuclear weapon. It's founded as a nuclear weapons laboratory. Right now, about half our business is associated with nuclear weapons, and half is associated with everything else, including energy storage, PV, wind, epidemiology, bio stuff, all kinds of stuff going on at Sandia, and I work in that other half that has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. But a lot of the work that has been done in nuclear weapons over the decades ends up carrying over into all the other work. So we have this little formula here that I'm sure you all have heard, that risk is a product of probability times consequence. So a high probability event with a low consequence is not very risky. A high probability event with a high consequence is very risky, and so on. So here we see a graph that helps capture some of that risk. These bars represent different sectors in electricity consumption, and we see here something everybody is familiar with. Most interruptions are very short and have little consequence, but as the interruptions get longer and longer, the consequences can go up and up and up. And so those are some of the things we care about and want to try to build into our thinking about how to make systems more resilient and how to make investments into more resilience. So Sandia has, I think, been on the forefront of developing methodologies and thinking about how to do resilience. This is some of the earlier literature, although this goes back to 2011, 2012. Eric Ugrin, the lead author on that study on the right, has been pioneering resilience studies since the early teens, and one of our colleagues, Bobby Jeffers, has been carrying it on. And that middle paper on the application to New Orleans is something I'm going to focus on in just a couple minutes. So when we talk about this formal approach to understanding vulnerabilities in communities and then developing systems to create greater resilience, there's two ways of looking at that. One is attribute-based, one is performance-based. I'm on slide 12 now, by the way. The attribute-based is more qualitative. It asks the kind of questions like, what makes my system more resilient? And you can qualitatively describe the different qualities, the different characteristics of your system that you think makes it resilient. But the performance-based is the way a lot of work is going now, and that's a much more quantitative approach to evaluating resilience. And it's more expensive, it requires a lot of data, it requires a lot of modeling, and that's what I'm going to describe very briefly in the next few slides. This is what we're trying to do. So here's the oscillation that you saw early on. The black line, the bold black line on slide 13 is the oscillation that occurs. System performance takes a hit on account of some kind of event. And that's bad for everybody, and we want to mitigate that giant oscillation. And so the gray dashed line represents the improved performance of the system with some adaptations made to improve resilience. And so we want to decrease the amplitude of that oscillation. We want to bring system performance back up to that straight line that we want more quickly. And that's going to take some planning, some thought, and money. An important set of questions to be asking when you're thinking about applying resilience to your community is, what are the issues that you care most about? What are the perturbations that you are most concerned about? And here's a methodology that has been developed as a result of these studies that I showed you earlier. I'm going to go through these quickly, but I know you have these presentations and you can go back through them yourselves if you care to, and always feel free to communicate with me or any of the other speakers throughout this series and ask questions or make comments. We'd love to hear from you, especially about how useful or relevant or irrelevant this stuff has been for you. So the first thing you do is you define your resilience goals. You define the consequences and the metrics of the possible perturbations that you're dealing with, the hazards. So are we talking about flooding? Are we talking about fire? Are we talking about cyber attacks? We want to think about the levels of disruption that might occur, and then we do the modeling. So we start collecting data from systems models that describe the way the systems will be affected by the different kinds of hazards. We try to calculate consequences. We use resilience metrics, which I'll describe in just a minute. Then we try to evaluate the impact that our resilience improvements will have on the system. And we just keep on iterating on this until we run out of money, we run out of time, we run out of energy, or we think we've come to the place where we need to be in terms of understanding how to address the resilience goals that we have. Now, in order to do all this, you need to be able to quantify some of these consequences. And so here are some examples of how these consequences are quantified. Community metrics like the number of people that will suffer without services, the lives that might be put at risk, the burden to acquire the services again after they've been disrupted, net economic losses. These are some easy ones to quantify. Net economic losses are relatively easy to quantify. Capital losses, costs to rebuild. And then security metrics. Now, this is a really difficult one to quantify. The ability to serve critical missions like police and fire or telecommunications for police and fire. How do you quantify the value of effective emergency response? It's hard to say whose lives you save, how much those lives are worth, stuff like that. So that's where quantifying the impact of your efforts on resilience start to get difficult. It's tough to place a dollar value on human lives. And it's important to remember that resilience is contextual. That is, if you build your system to be resilient to flooding, you might not be resilient to other things like fire in California or cyber attack or earthquake or whatever those perturbations may be. So I'm going to talk briefly about this case study in New Orleans where this methodology that was developed here at Sandia was applied. And I want to say that this cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, this approach. It was funded partly by DOE. It was funded partly by, I believe, the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities project, and New Orleans kicked in some funds too. So it's a really expensive project. And a couple of things that I want to say about that is, one, Sandia as a national laboratory, this is true of all the national labs, we have to do work that no one else is doing. We have to stay out in front of commercial and industrial processes because it's not fair to take taxpayer dollars, use them in a national lab to compete against private business. So we're always trying to stay out front. So we're doing all this prototypic stuff that is hard to do, stuff for which there's no set methodology. So this is an example of that. It cost a lot for us to do it, to put these pieces in place, but now presumably independent consultants can go out, take this methodology and apply it to places like Baltimore, or this was also done in Norfolk, Virginia. An earlier phase of this kind of work was done in Norfolk. And one might argue that, several $100,000 in this case is expensive. If you could do it much more cheaply, it might make more sense. But it could still be expensive. But if you're thinking about investing millions of dollars into some kind of resilience effort, it might make a lot of sense to do something rigorous at the beginning to be sure that you're doing all the right stuff. So in New Orleans, this started with a big stakeholder effort, bringing together stakeholders from all across New Orleans, from all across the experts who could help the analysts figure out how we're going to look at resilience in New Orleans, what the consequences of different kinds of perturbations might be, how wide are the oscillations, how do we bring them down. And you can see that list of stakeholders on the top left that were involved in this lengthy collaborative process to figure out how to move forward in New Orleans. So I'm going to flip through a bunch of slides now just to give you a taste of the kind of quantitative modeling and approaches that were required. So this is a simulated hurricane track coming ashore in the New Orleans area. These are models of wind speeds and flood depths. This is empirical data on slide 17 of utility restoration after different hurricanes. One thing that you got to do if you're going to do this kind of work is you got to figure out where your critical assets are. So if you have a good GIS of your city or of your state or of your region and you've got all of these critical assets already marked, that's great. If you don't, you got to go back and do that. And that's labor intensive, expensive, but very useful. And after you've located the critical assets, you got to figure out what are the consequences to those different assets. So in New Orleans, they divided the city up into these different zones that represented different kinds of flooding risks. Then after that, you figure out what are the alternatives that you want to apply. So in this case, it was microgrids. And we'll talk more about microgrids in a minute, but as you all know, microgrids consist of some generation source, be that diesel or natural gas or PV or something else, plus some storage, and then a load associated with that. So the planners in New Orleans decided what kinds of alternatives they wanted to apply, and then it took a bunch of modeling to begin to assess. I'm on slide 21 now. A bunch of modeling to assess what the potential consequences were of those alternatives in all of these different sectors, and then you just do it all over again. You change the alternatives, you do the modeling again, and you see if it brings you to the place that you want to be in terms of resilience. So let me change gears now and talk much more about energy storage. This is a picture of projects that Sandia, in collaboration with DOE, has undertaken all around the country to build demonstration projects or pilot projects. I don't want to call them all that because they're more than that. They're working energy storage projects, but they're leveraged with DOE money, thanks to Dr. Zook, who's on the line, and others. And so these are efforts to help communities and states and cities figure out how to use energy storage in their grid operations. So all of these different, there's a couple dozen here. Most of these are not built with resilience as their primary intention, with resilience as the most important part of their planned operation. And at some point, it might be, some of the others online might be able to comment more about some of this. But anyway, there's a lot of projects that have been put in place. Most of these are built to take advantage of various value streams, but resilience is not the most important one. Now, here's a slide showing of all of those couple dozen, the projects where resilience was intended to play an important part, and there's a couple where resilience was the primary function of the system. One is in Sterling, Massachusetts, one was in Eugene, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the one in Sterling in just a couple minutes. So the point of this is that energy storage for serving a primary function of resilience is not terrifically widespread just yet, but it's growing in interest all the time. So let me talk a little bit about resiliency and how ES fits into that. And it's generally in combination with microgrids, and there's all kinds of different microgrid applications. At its most fundamental level, places like Intel here in our own Middle Rio Grande Valley, commercial and industrial operations that can't afford to have a power outage, police and fire who don't want their systems to go down, even in the briefest power outage, have batteries that kick in when the outage occurs, because batteries can kick in really, really fast in milliseconds or, milliseconds and, a second or two. The battery can detect the outage, kick in, provide the power until the diesel or natural gas systems ramp up, and then the battery system can go off. Now, in those situations, you need, relatively small battery that stays charged all the time. It's always ready for the power outage. And that's one application. That is a microgrid. If you don't have a battery that can island itself from the grid, that is when the grid goes down, if the battery isn't designed so that it will either stay up or come back up after the outage, then it's no use in any kind of resiliency application. So talking about these natural gas or especially these diesel generators, they're very effective for short-term or even long-term resiliency, but they have problems. They make noise, they pollute the air, you have to stockpile the fuel, and it can go bad over time. These generators take regular maintenance. When the outages occurred in Puerto Rico in the last couple of years, they had a lot of the diesel generators that were supposed to kick in and provide power, but they had not been properly maintained, and so they failed. And so those provided no resiliency whatsoever. There's a lot of ways to mix energy storage, PV, diesel, natural gas into grid operations. And so this is kind of a funny quote, but I've heard this said a couple different times. Batteries are the bacon in this system. So it depends how you feel about bacon, but a little bit of bacon, some would say, makes, everything better. I've even seen, we've all seen bacon on donuts. That seems a little weird to me, but a little bit of bacon in a meal might make it better, but all bacon might not, a meal of all bacon might not be the best meal. So The point being that you have to figure out how to mix energy storage in to meet the demands and the needs that you have. And that takes forethought, it takes thinking, and that takes planning. And this goes back to something I said on day one. You got to know what you're building your energy storage system for when you build it, so that you can get so that you build it properly, so that you get the right returns out of it. And you don't have to go back and rebuild it. It's an expensive thing. You don't want to make a mistake early on. And this is a picture of the Stirling system, which I keep promising we're going to come back to, and we will. Another few words about how energy storage for resilience can complicate energy storage management. So again, you have to ask yourself, what kind of resilience are you planning for? And are you planning for scheduled outages or unscheduled outages? So there's different ways to plan to use your energy storage system. You can use it to derive various benefits. If we went back a slide, you'd see there's lots of different value streams that can come from an energy storage system in a microgrid. So there's grid stability, diesel deferral, renewable firming, renewable smoothing, and more. And so when you design your system, you might design your system to provide all of those services. And, so those would be stacked services. And but then what happens when you have an emergency? Is your battery depleted? Is it discharged because you've been using it for all of these other economic values, or do you have a fully charged batteries? That's a question you have to ask yourself when you're deciding how to build your system. The other way is to plan for the crisis that you know is coming. Plan for a hurricane, plan for bad weather, make sure your battery is fully charged when that bad weather hits, and then you're in good shape, and you've met your resilience standard. And then the last bullet really refers back to the first bullet. So anyway, these are kinds of things you have to think about with regards to designing your battery. When you there's lots of different ways to value energy storage, but some of them are hard. Now, we've talked earlier on in the first session, and then in the economics session when Ray Byrne and Patrick Balducci talked about different methods for valuing energy storage. There's lots of ways to value all of the different value streams: frequency regulation, ramping, balancing, time shifts, and so on. But when you're looking at resilience, it's a little bit more challenging. So there's these acronyms: CAIDI, CAIFI, SAIDI, SAIFI. All of those can be used to begin to value energy storage. But LBNL, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, has done some pioneering work in taking some of those indices and building them into a really neat calculator that can give you a sense of how what the value of a lost load might be over a bunch of different customer sectors. And so this 2009 paper by Sullivan et al. Is one of the early papers in terms of valuing lost load. And then here's the calculator. You can go to it, and I encourage you to go to it. It's really simple, very straightforward, kind of fun, and you can play with it and get a sense of, if you know some of these values, you can get a sense of how you might calculate the value of the lost load in your region. However, there's one caveat to all this, and that is public administration is a category that covers police, fire, rescue, and some of that, how do you, it's hard to value that, as we've talked earlier. It's hard to value a life that may be saved by prompt fire or police or other kinds of emergency response. So, we tend to may tend to underestimate the value, and that's one of the difficulties of trying to value resilience. So here's a case study, Stirling Municipal Light Department. This is how they approached their problem. They designed this system to be resilient to hurricanes and ice storms. That's it. And those are predictable events. You see the hurricane moving up the coast. You know that it's going to hit in a day or two or three, and you make sure your battery is fully charged. Same with ice storms. You can predict that it's coming. A cold weather front is coming, and you're going to have, you can at least look ahead and anticipate an ice storm. And so you make sure your battery is charged. And when you're not anticipating one of these events, you can be using the battery to serve all of these other value streams. And in Massachusetts at Sterling, they're using it to do energy arbitrage, reduction in monthly network service charges and network capacity payment charges, and to do frequency regulation. So this system, I'm not sure what the total cost of this system ended up being, but it was roughly $4 million for a 2 megawatt, 3.9 megawatt hour system that includes PV. So this is great because you might have a hurricane that comes through and you're not going to get any PV on day one of the hurricane, but maybe on day two the hurricane passes and you start recharging your battery. You might have depleted it some on day one, and on day two you can start recharging it. So this is approximately a $4 million system, and they're getting the modeled results for this system show approximately $1 million annually in revenue. So that's a 4 to 6 year payoff, and the battery's going to last 12 years. So economically speaking, this is a good investment on the part of Sterling. However, it needs to be pointed out that this is a really oversized battery. This is a 16-day battery given this tiny load that Sterling wanted to meet. So this is police and fire communications. That's all. And they have this 3.9, this almost 4,000 kilowatt hour battery to meet a 10 kilowatt hour load. It's approximately 400 hours over, divided by 24 hours in a day. It's about a 16-day battery. That's a lot. There aren't that many batteries in the world that are built to provide power for 16 days. And one of the reasons they could do it was because they had DOE money, they had grant money, and they had their own money to build this system. And so it's a great example of a economically viable battery built to serve resilience primarily. Okay, I want to switch gears one more time, and this is basically the last gear switching. I guess I'm going to end early, and that's okay. Maybe we have some time for questions or comments from others on the line, and also we can take a little bit of a break. But this is more about the question of the resilience of energy storage systems and the resilience of renewables, the renewables effort and decarbonization efforts nationwide and worldwide. And in this case, I'm thinking of resilience as the ability of all the industries to avoid bottlenecks that could occur for all kinds of reasons. So let me talk a little bit about this picture here. There's about 16 states in the United States, and there's more coming all the time that are adopting 100% renewable goals or 100% decarbonization goals, and that's great. We are increasingly deciding as a national or global community that we need to replace fossil fuels with renewables. And so we're creating these mandates, but no one has a clue how to achieve them. So we've got this mandate of 100% decarbonization of renewables by 2040, 2050, 2045 here in New Mexico, but no one has a roadmap for how to get there. No one has a clue how to get there. My colleagues here at Sandia have done some work on this, and I think this is just really important work. They built an optimization routine to figure out what's the optimal mix of energy storage, PV, and wind in the state of New Mexico to meet these 100% carbon-free goals by 2045. And now I got to say that this assumes that the state of New Mexico is a piece of copper. That is, there are no transmission challenges across the state. Doesn't matter where you generate this electricity or where you store it or where you need it. It ignores transmission challenges. So that's an assumption. You've got to make assumptions in models like this. That's an important assumption made, and I know that my colleagues are trying to think about how to build transmission into this model, but the point is that this is going to be an underestimate of the demands required to meet these goals, because this energy is going to have to be transmitted across the state, and there's going to be losses associated with that. So that said, given what we have about about 2 gigawatts of wind in the state. And in order to meet these future goals, we need about 5 gigawatts. Okay, that's manageable. In my mind, that's manageable. We got about a gigawatt of PV, and in order to meet these goals by 2040, we're going to need 10 gigawatts. Even that is manageable, but look at the energy storage requirements. We don't have close to a gigawatt. We're going to need 5 gigawatts. This is an astronomical increase in the amount of energy storage required in the state of New Mexico to meet these goals by 2045. We're one of 16 states right now trying to figure out how to meet these goals, and presumably more and more states are going to be adopting these kinds of goals in the years to come. So how are we going to do it? Where is it all going to come from? You've seen this slide before. Ray put it up showing the comparison of the power that comes from the Raccoon Mountain Pumped Hydro facility in Tennessee, about 1,600 megawatts, 1.6 gigawatts, 22-hour system. And if you tried to do that with lithium ion, it would take 20 billion 18650 cells, 3 times the distance to the moon. The moon is 200,000 miles away, so we're looking at about a 600,000 mile line of little batteries just to meet this pumped hydro equivalent. And it's just a lot of batteries. And we're banking right now on lithium ion. We see lithium ion generally as, you know, that's the elephant in the room now when it comes to application of batteries to all of these problems that we're trying to address. But so there are materials issues associated with all of these technologies, renewable energy technologies. I'm on slide 31 now. Renewable energy technologies and energy storage technologies. This list on the left shows you some of the leading materials that are required. On the right, you see the results of a couple different studies showing what the projected increases in demand will be for light-duty passenger, electric vehicles, energy storage. Some of it is astronomical. Now, I got to point out that these are just a couple different studies, and this is a new field. We're just starting to address some of these issues, and we're just starting to try to figure it out. And my boss, Babu, who might even be on the line, he thinks that the marketplace is going to solve all of these issues, that when demand for these things goes up, then new resources will be found, new supply chains will be put in place, demand will be met, and all of that may be true, but there will also be other consequences. So the point that I'm working on here is that we're depending on fossil fuels now to provide us with all our energy needs. We want to switch to renewables. There turned out to be unintended consequences of our fossil fuel consumption. What are going to be the unintended consequences of ramping up all this renewables and energy storage? What are they going to be? And we aren't thinking clearly enough, I don't think, about all those questions. Supply chain issues for rare earth elements. I just sat through a webinar last week on supply chain issues associated with exactly these things and energy storage, and they're already being challenged. These supply chains right now are being challenged by the coronavirus and the breakdowns in supply chains that are occurring now and are anticipated to be occurring. With regards to rare earth elements, China is the leading source, not only of the ores that are required, but of the processing of these ores. Now, rare earth elements aren't really rare. They're all over the place. They're all over the planet. But mining them is dirty and results in toxic stuff. And so it's a challenge. It's a problem. By the way, wind turbine generators, neodymium, 700. One source I have shows approximately 700 pounds of neodymium for every single wind turbine generator. So as we build more and more wind turbine generators, we need more and more neodymium. Here's a study that shows that in order to meet demand in energy storage and PV, projected demand out to 2050, using lithium as the source, we're going to need, using lithium-ion batteries as the source, we're going to need over 400% of the cobalt, the known cobalt reserves. and we're going to need over 250% of the known lithium reserves in order to get there. Now, are there unknown reserves? Yes. Will they be found as demand goes up? Yes. But what will be the unintended consequences of that? Supply chain bottlenecks. I'm lumping together a whole bunch of things here, but there's a long list of them. And as we move forward in this effort to replace fossil fuels with renewables and batteries, some of these things are going to become more noteworthy, more prominent. People will object to the waste issues associated with these different technologies, with the toxic mining. Life cycle assessment is a science that is up and coming. It's been up and coming for a while, and it's a science where you evaluate all of the inputs to a kind of technology, that is the water, the energy, the toxic chemicals, the waste outputs. And then you can compare apples to apples when you're thinking about the consequences, the waste streams, the energy requirements, and so on associated with different technologies. Cobalt is mined by kids in Africa in horrible conditions. There's energy inequity and injustice issues that we're just beginning to scratch the surface of, and so on. Now, this is a picture on the right of used wind turbines going into a landfill. And to be completely honest, I've got to note that the total landfill space being used up by wind turbines is extremely small. So this is a dramatic picture, but it's, you know, 1 or 2 landfills in the country that are being used for wind turbines right now. But it begs the question, in the 21st century, do we want to be taking stuff out of the ground, turning it into wind turbines, using them for 10, 15, 20 years, and then throwing them away again? Is this the best way to achieve this 100% renewable, 100% decarbonized future that we hope to be moving into? So transmission, some people will say that transmission, the guy named Mark O'Malley from NREL, who's great expert in all these topics, asserts that transmission is the solution to all of this, that if we could move the wind energy from the Midwestern states east and west, if we could move the PV from the southwest, west and east, if we had all the transmission in place to do this, then we wouldn't even need energy storage. But transmission has all of its own problems. There are some options available. Those big transmission projects that I've got listed on the bottom are all part of the solution, but they're all on hold because of siting issues, jurisdictional issues, environmental reviews. It's not easy to build a 1,000-mile transmission system across the United States. Nobody wants it in their backyard. There's a really interesting project down here. Which one is it? This one right here, this green HVDC, high voltage direct current link. They want to put this in railroad right-of-ways underground. So that's a great solution. The right-of-ways already exist. It can go underground, so it's safer, it's more resilient, it's less impact from bad weather or other kinds of perturbations. So there's a great solution, but it's one possible solution, and to think that there's a silver bullet probably is not the right way to look at this. Let me focus for just a minute on one possible solution space to address all of these big issues. It's adoption of a circular economy. So just as unrealistic as transmission might be to solve all the problems, or as energy storage might be to solve all the problems, adopting a circular economy might be equally unrealistic because it's so difficult to do. But basically the linear economy means we take stuff out of the ground, we take stuff out of the whatever resource we have, we use it, and then we throw it away. That's a linear economy. The circular economy means we design stuff so that it can be taken apart, reused, not recycling. Some people say recycling is downcycling because there's so many losses in recycling. This is building stuff so that it can be disassembled and retrieved and rebuilt into the same thing, and so you really minimize your losses. The circular economy has all kinds of benefits. It reduces extraction, it reduces the waste stream, It reduces bottlenecks, international supply chain bottlenecks if we're doing this all in country. And, it's good for a lot of different things, but it's really hard to do. I'm on slide 38 now. It's really hard to do. It requires much greater investment up front, much greater ingenuity in building stuff so that it can be taken apart. You need new supply chains to return stuff to factories that reuse stuff. So it takes costs that are externalized now, and it internalizes some of them. And some of those internalized costs get applied up front. But, who knows how we can apply this? It's probably just one more solution in a long set of solution spaces. So let me begin to close this all out by saying we've got all kinds of technologies rising to help us meet some of these grandiose goals that we have, and really important goals. Don't get me wrong. I'm 100% myself behind meeting all these goals. And the only point that I'm trying to make is that we don't know how we're going to get there. And this is the time to be starting to think more about the pathway. What are the mixes of all of these different technologies that are going to get us there, and how are we going to put them into place? I did 15 years of modeling water, energy, food systems, trying to figure out how you optimize the resource systems so that if you need more water, where's it going to come from? If you need more ag, where's it going to come from? How much more water is it going to take to do the ag? How much more water is it going to take to create the energy? And so on. And in the years of doing that, one of the truisms that we came to is that there are no silver bullets. There are always stakeholder groups that think there's going to be a silver bullet. If you just do this, then that'll solve the problem. Or if you just do that. But in general, when we tried to actually model these systems, we found there weren't any silver bullets, but they took a big mix of, all of the above technologies. And so this list on the bottom is some of the technologies. Now, I'm glad to be teeing up Ralph because he's going to talk about non-wires alternatives. That is energy storage as a non-wires alternative to congestion issues and generation issues in the grid. There's high voltage DC transmission, cleaner batteries for short duration energy storage, new energy storage technologies for longer duration applications, more wind, more PV, better end of life solutions like circular economy solutions, and then something that we just seem to be forgetting, reduced consumption and greater efficiency. And as we consider all of these things, we need to be thinking about the unintended consequences. Do you all see green? This is supposed to be a little bit of an animation, but I hope you can see what I see. There's this quote from Buckminster Fuller, which I've always thought was really a great quote. This came out in a book in 1969 when I was just a kid, and I didn't read it then. But if you were in a shipwreck and a piano top came floating by, you might climb on top of it and use it as a life preserver. But if you were in the business of designing life preservers, you would not build them in the shape of a piano top. And that's what we humans have been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years, or maybe thousands of years as we develop technologies. We are generally blind to the long-term unintended consequences of these technologies. And so on the bottom, there's some pictures of some of the technologies that we've adopted that we know now have unintended consequences that we don't like. And this transition to renewables and energy storage is a really, really important one. And I think we got to watch out that we're not just shifting a set of unpleasant, unintended consequences from one set of sectors to another, and that's going to take some foresight and some thought and some planning and a lot of modeling, a lot of stakeholder involvement, and so that's where I hope we all will end up going. So with that, I'm done. I want to express my appreciation to all of my colleagues at Sandia National Labs who have contributed to this presentation and to all of my work, and to Dr. Zhuk, who's on the line, who has funded all of this work. With that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions. Thanks very much, everybody, for your attention.
All right, Howard, this is Molly. We have a number of questions in the chat box. You can pop that open and see most of them. One of them came in just to me. I'm going to read them out as we go, both for the recording and for anybody that can't find the chat window. So Chuck Brody said that his main comment is to bear in mind that for resilience, there's frequently need for new or additional electrical distribution infrastructure, even microgrid distances less than 1 mile, which can substantially increase the cost of achieving capability. How has Sandia factored that consideration into their discussion and analysis?
Okay, I'm sorry. I was trying to read and I wasn't listening carefully enough. I don't see that in the chat list. Am I missing that somehow?
Yeah, that one came in just to me. Do you want me to repeat it?
No, but let me go back to the first one, which I've read and I can respond to.
Sure.
And I'll read that. Regarding how much storage is needed to meet New Mexico's 100% clean energy requirement, did your colleagues look at a scenario where renewables could be transmitted from out of state? No. So there's no transmission involved in that, and that was meeting the objectives completely with in-state generation. So that's the answer to that one. And again, that's, you got to make some assumptions when you do this sort of thing, and that's the assumption built into that. Molly, may I move down to the next question, which I can read?
Yeah, and Chuck went ahead and sent his comment to everybody as well. So once you get through Delegate Charkoudians, you can move on to the next one.
Okay. Do the assumptions about what the amount of storage needed to meet the mandates assume current levels of efficiency? Demand response. Oops, I lost it. Demand response, grid structures, we clearly need to ramp up storage capabilities. Can we make those numbers more realistic with better investments in the grid in energy efficiency, demand response? Ray might be on, one of our, my colleague, one of my bosses who worked on that study, Babu might be on and might be able to address those better than me, but I would say that all of those values are taken as they are now and not projected forward into the future. So that would be another thing to do in this study, that is make some assumptions about how demand response might be integrated, how efficiency might change, and so on. Ray or Babu, do any of you guys want to add to that comment?
Babu is unmuted, and I'm looking for Ray real quick. I don't hear anything coming in from them.
Hey, Howard, it's
Okay.
Ralph. If I could chime in on that.
Please.
Yeah, today when you get involved in planning, and I'll talk about that in the case study, the issue of how you forecast energy efficiency and demand response is always raised, right? And there's kind of a mantra out there today that says load is decreasing, not increasing, because of energy efficiency. And that's true for the physical load that exists today. But what has to be factored in are state goals for electrification. And so, later I'll come to that. But if you start looking at what electrification means, it swamps the effects of energy efficiency. And, I'll be happy to take questions on that as I get to it in the slides coming up.
Thanks, Ralph. That's a really great point. As the roads get filled with energy, with electric vehicles, or as houses and commercial properties and industry starts using heat pumps for residential heating and cooling, and so the electricity demand is going to skyrocket.
That's right. And just a factoid, Dominion Electric in Virginia is now a winter peaking utility again. And the reason is oil converted to heat pump.
Right, and I read recently that maybe 10% penetration of electric vehicles will move peak to evening time, peak demand to evening time when people are charging their cars. So anyway, let me go on and I'll turn this over. Go ahead, Ralph.
No, I said later.
Later than that, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go to Chuck Brody's comment. Main comment is to bear in mind that for resilience, there's frequently need for new additional electrical distribution, and transmission, even microgrid distances less than 1 mile, which can substantially increase the cost of achieving. How has Cindy affected that consideration into their discussion and analysis? And there are people in my group working hard on microgrids. It's not me, so I don't know exactly, Ray or Babu, if you can chime in, but I know people are working on that stuff. So I don't know if there's anybody who can address that question more directly.
Well,
okay,
I don't
so moving on.
Anymore.
Sorry, Molly?
I don't see Ray on the call anymore.
Okay. And then Chuck's last comment looks to me, I'm involved with a project in Connecticut where that represents 35% of overall project cost and it doesn't attach revenue. I'm not sure what you mean by attach revenue, Chuck. Please feel free to make more of a comment on that. But I think one of the main points that Chuck is making is that there are lots of costs and lots of demands involved in all of this, and they can drive prices up and they drive demand for materials up and so on. Chuck, do you want to add?
Not sure if I'm off mute.
No,
You're
I hear
good.
you.
Okay, so just the point being, projects that get done to provide resiliency have all of these multiple dimensions. The comment about the project I'm on.
Ralph, Chuck, can you speak up? Can you speak up?
Yep, hang on 1 second. Is that better?
Yes.
Can folks hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, Chuck. Now we're not hearing anything.
Can folks?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Can folks hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, the two comments went together. We've got a project where 35% of an overall project cost is just putting infrastructure in underground, which is a mandate for resiliency as opposed to being pulled. So, the notion of having attached revenue, we really get to a business case with project investment, and that is, 35% of the cost of the project in and of itself doesn't generate revenue to offset its cost. So anything we can get from value stack on a battery or operation of generating sources is weighed down by that infrastructure cost. I'll mute. That was the comment. I just, I'm curious if we're trying to get the project beneficiaries to understand the value of what we're putting in. In some of the slides, you had some great ideas about how to sort of value resiliency, but I just wanted to add the comments about underhanging costs.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that I have nothing to add to that. I think it's a really relevant point to make. So I'm noting the time, and I'm going to sign off, and you won't be hearing from me again, but I want to say thank you all so much. It's been a great privilege and an honor to be able to work with you all over the last 4 weeks to do this. Molly, thank you so much. You've been terrific to work with. I think you all might have gotten an evaluation form from Molly, so if you or you're so inclined, please send us comments about what worked, what didn't work, what was good, what was less good, and so on. We'd love to get the feedback because we're going to keep doing these workshops around the country, and we'd be happy to come back and do more with you guys if you have deeper dives that you're interested in. If you've heard stuff that you want to dig more deeply into, we would love to help facilitate that. So thanks, everybody. I'm going to sign off, and Molly's going to take over again.
Thank you so much, Howard. I can speak for the whole PSC, I think, by saying how much we appreciate the time and effort that Cindy has put in and DOE. We are going to take a 10-minute break, so we'll be back at 1:10, and I'm going to pass the floor over to Ralph after that. And yeah, as I said in my email yesterday, this is the first time Cindy has done this. We've all put this together on the fly. Normally, this is an in-person, full day, 8-hour presentation of a series of topics. So if there's any input that the audience has, bearing in mind that, some of the technology stuff is not entirely within our control, we would really appreciate knowing how this was for the audience as compared to the in-person option. So with that, we'll see everybody at 1:10.
I hope this next presentation will justify your investment of time. Before I begin, a little full disclosure. Quanta Technology is a subsidiary of Quanta Services, a big gas and electric infrastructure services company. And we're a partner of Sandia doing work around energy storage. And it's in that context that I'm here, part of the agenda today. Much of Quanta Technologies' work is with electric utilities. And so I just specifically wanted to mention that we're currently engaged with Potomac Holdings on various activities, including energy storage in the District of Columbia and New Jersey, but not so far Maryland. But thought it would be meaningful to just mention that as we get into this. So moving from Howard's presentation to mine is a little bit of from the sublime to the down and dirty. I'll be going through case studies of actual storage projects, the planning, the evaluation, and so on. And the non-wires alternative applications are usually very relevant to state commissions, because here we're talking about storage that's utility owned on the distribution, subtransmission systems, and where state policy, regulatory evaluations become critical. And I titled it Storage as a Non-Wires Alternative simply because around the country, more and more states have initiatives underway to even require and mandate that traditional utility grid investment projects compare non-wires alternatives, distributed resources, addressing whatever issues were causing the grid investment. And storage plays prominently in that analysis, of course, because it's flexible. It can be used for peak shaving and so on to mitigate forecast grid overloads. And so it's, and combined with photovoltaic, then it's a very powerful resource. So the non-wires alternative is another motivator for looking at storage on the grid. And I'm pretty sure that Jeremy Twitchell presented this to you in one of the earlier sessions from the PNNL database on storage projects. And so I don't need to go through it again. But the state initiatives on renewable portfolio standards, clean energy, electrification, energy storage, and non-wires alternatives all are interrelated when you start to analyze the impacts and the requirements. And understanding that coupling is something that will be more and more important in the coming years. So I have to tell a little history here. Going back, 12 years now, I was engaged with others in doing the use case analysis, as it was called at the time, for the California PUC. And this was in the run-up to AB 2514, the storage mandate. And we were arguing strongly that the state ought to do an analysis of how much storage, where, and why. And EPRI was also involved in front of the CPUC, and they were preaching the same message. However, other voices won out, and AB 2514 came out mandating the storage, but without the homework of how much do we need and where and why. And today, that's even more the case because you've got clean energy goals, electrification goals, offshore wind goals, and understanding how storage plays with all of those is just critical before putting out a mandate. And after California, it was almost as though we saw competition among the states. New York came out with a mandate, and then New Jersey came out with a mandate. New Jersey did do some homework beforehand. They engaged Rutgers University to do an analysis that could inform that answer of how much, where, when, why. And the analyses usually take two thrusts. One is looking at it as part of a resource mix. What's storage do to the capacity markets? What's it do to the energy markets using production costing simulations and so on? And second is, well, what's it mean to the transmission and distribution system? And that's the non-wires alternative analysis. This little bubble flow chart says what goes into looking at the impacts on the benefits to the T&D system. One is, as we talked earlier, what's the load profile and the distributed resource penetration and profile going to look at. And that involves not only traditional load forecasting, but photovoltaic adoption, electric vehicle adoption, heat pump adoption, and critically, and not addressed today in any of these studies, impacts of climate change. What will climate change do to the load? What might it do to photovoltaic or wind production? And also, what does climate change mean to the T&D system? Elevated temperatures and elevated humidity mean degraded asset life. Storage plays into that too. So all of these things really should be thought of. Energy market characteristics, and the big unknown in the production costing simulations going forward is what happens when you've got 100% renewables. When the marginal cost of the market clearing is zero, how is it going to work? And if you then throw storage into the mix, what is the objective now? So how do you look at the energy market characteristics with a longer term forward horizon is a challenge. And then, of course, the battery storage technologies, costs, performance, and so on. Regulatory environment plays in because of the question that says, when can the utility own the storage asset, and how can the utility use that asset? And if the utility does use it to get some extra market revenue, how are those revenues then returned to the ratepayer? So I'll try to touch on these as we go through the case study. Okay, quick chart that talks about what are the analytical tools that are out there today that are commonly used, and how do they play into all of the planning analyses and use of storage. And I won't go over all of them one at a time. The headline that I want to get across is the tools that are, let me say, in the public domain, and these would be StorageVet from EPRI and the storage analysis tool that Sandia talked about. They do an excellent job of looking at the market revenues available, the energy arbitrage, the ancillary services, and have good databases behind them of what's going on in the different markets. Those tools, generally speaking, don't integrate with the transmission and distribution planning tools. So they have a gap in how do they address the T&D applications. The commercial T&D planning tools, SIME, Synergy, OpenDSS, MillSoft, Power Factory, these are the tools that utilities use for planning the distribution system, are very weak on incorporating storage. In some cases, they don't do it at all. In other cases, they have storage, but you can't talk about how it's used, and you certainly can't link it to stacked applications. On the transmission side, the picture's a little bit better, but still not great. And isn't talked about so much on the slide, but if you look at the production costing tools, ProMod especially, which is so widely used, but the others is listed, they all have their gaps with respect to storage. Plexos and Analytics are probably the most capable in dealing with storage today, but ProMod less so. We just finished a benchmark of all of the security constraint intercommitment analytics used in market clearing, and the headline there is very few of that body of software, the things used at the ISOs, cope well with storage. And only in California have they had to confront having lots of storage resources in the market, in the actual day-ahead energy market. If you look at, say, PJM, they've got anywhere from 500 to 1,000 megawatts of storage in the ancillaries market, but not in the day-ahead energy market. And storage in the day-ahead energy market just confounds the mixed integer programming algorithms used in that software. So there's some gaps. And I'm going to focus today on the gap in that between storage and the T&D planning tools. So going back to that bubble chart, in order to understand how storage plays into the system, you've got to do time series power flow simulations, because storage moves energy from one moment in time to another. In the transmission world, the past decade has seen doing 87, 60-hour time series simulations become routine. It's buried into ProMod and so on. It's buried into any FERC 1000 analysis of new transmission. If you look at the distribution system, not so. Distribution planning typically revolved around the forecast peak, the so-called 90-10 peak, the peak temperature that would occur in the 10th percentile and what the load would be as a result. Increasingly for PV hosting, it also looks at a shoulder month Sunday afternoon, a bright Sunday afternoon in mid or late April, maximum PV production, minimum load. For PV hosting, to do storage, you've got to do the time series analysis, and with all that implies on the planning side. A lot of discussion on stacked applications. We had a question on that earlier. I'll go through some case studies and talk about that. If we're doing planning and we're talking about storage across an entire power system or an entire state, it's a multi-year forecast of how much storage we need when, and that means we need to have an idea about what storage is going to cost in the future. And so the cost projections for storage become critical to this too, and the performance projections, how the batteries degrade with time. So lots of fun things to think about. Okay, this is just a block diagram of all the pieces that go into looking at storage on a distribution system. If you are looking at a particular circuit problem, then you analyze that circuit. If we're looking at an entire system, we want to look at the entire population of stations and circuits and finding the candidates today and in the near and midterm future where storage is a feasible solution. And the applications that get looked at First and foremost is capacity deferral. If we have new customers coming online or a forecast load growth, can we defer reconductoring, replacing a transformer, et cetera, by using storage for peak shaving? DER integration means, can we increase the hosting capacity? Simply put, can we control voltage problems and backfeed issues and flicker issues that occur with high PV penetration? Howard talked a lot about reliability and resiliency, and there are special cases where storage makes sense to improve reliability. For instance, if you have a circuit on a peninsula, it's sticking out into the ocean, let's say, and there is no parallel circuit for N-1 load rollover. So if there's an outage, the concepts of isolating the outage and then restoring the downstream sections with switching become very expensive, because you'd have to put that parallel circuit in. And to make it truly reliable, you wouldn't put the parallel circuit in on the same poles. You'd want different geography. So on a peninsula, storage can make a lot of sense. And there are other cases that have a similar flavor. Microgrids are popular, and I'll go through a particular case study on storage in a public microgrid, which gets back to the utility ownership question, interestingly. Then for market participation, you've got to analyze, as Sandia showed with their applications, how would you optimally use the battery in the market, given the constraints that you've got to observe for the primary reliability application serving the T&D system. In other words, when it's not needed for peak shaving, what can you do with it in the markets? And I'll go through a different perspective on that with a different tool. And then especially when we're looking at the DER integration, you're into simulating the circuit, which means the storage analytics have to integrate with the distribution planning analytics. And finally, at the end, cost-benefit analysis that has to be framed in different ways. One perspective is the utility perspective. What's it mean to cash flow, to return on investment, to P&L? Another perspective that's critical is the ratepayer perspective. What's it mean to the revenue requirement to support the asset and to the ratepayers? And then if you're looking at it from the developer's perspective, there's yet another way to do the financial analysis. So 2 key points. Policy decisions matter a lot here, and the utility ownership model dictates how the stacked applications come into play, along with the technical issues on what services are realistic for storage. And so we'll see that in the examples. The transmission story is pretty similar, that you replace the distribution planning tools with the transmission planning tools, and they have different names. And then another key point, and we'll see this in some of the applications, in distribution, reliability is a constraint. In other words, the storage is being used, let's say, to shave the peak. That means the flow on the circuit has to stay below the peak. How the storage is used is dictated by that. It's a constraint. In transmission, reliability becomes fungible as congestion cost, and how storage therefore plays into the congestion cost is a wholesale market analysis, not a reliability analysis. Okay, I think you saw a little of this from Sandia earlier, but if we're looking at storage for capacity deferral, we need to look ahead N years, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and say, what's the peak going to be? So we need that medium-term load forecast, adjust the load profile, the weather adjustment, et cetera, electrification forecasting, look at the circuit, do the time series analysis, and see what the storage profile has to be to peak shave. Now, here's an interesting little point you can see by looking at the yellow area under the curve. As we move out in time, if the load grows, the amplitude of the peak grows. That drives the battery power rating, the size of the inverter. So the megawatt or kilowatt size increases typically linearly with time. But the area under the curve gets wider and increases as the square of time. So if we look at the deferral problem and ask the question, what's the best deferral period to aim for? Is it 3 years or 4? There's a race here. The longer we defer, the greater the savings when we net present value back. But the longer we defer, the bigger the battery's got to be and the more it costs. And so that analysis becomes a race between these two effects. And then to further complicate it, you can build the inverter and the balance of plant for the forecast peak size at the end of the deferral period and add battery capacity as you go along as it's needed. Okay, now the battery's unused outside that peak shaving period, and that's when we can do market participation. So let's talk about market participation. First, we've got the constraints from capacity deferral. CD is an acronym for capacity deferral, or photovoltaic integration. The market participation is secondary to those requirements. The economics are improved with market participation. We heard that in the comment at the end of the last presentation. But the regulated utility may or may not be allowed to do that. If the regulated utility is contracting for storage services for grid reliability, and the developer then says they'll be in the market when they're not providing the reliability, it's going to raise a host of operational questions. From a reliability and obligation to serve point of view, the utility wants control. And of course, the developer would prefer not to do that, but that's a fundamental issue. Okay, different models.
Hey, Ralph, I'm going to jump in real quick. You asked me to keep you on track. If we're going to leave time for Dr. Zook and any questions, you have about 20 minutes and about 35
okay,
slots.
Great. Thank you very much, Molly.
Yep.
I'll hurry up. If the utility can't be in the energy market, it's strictly doing capacity deferral, and maybe that's only needed 20 hours a year. And of course, when it's doing the capacity deferral, it automatically gets an arbitrage benefit. But those applications rarely pencil out economically. If you say you're doing time arbitrage plus capacity deferral and passing the savings on, then they pencil out. The ancillaries market looks attractive, but if you said to a utility, you're going to have a 1 megawatt battery in the reg market sitting on a circuit, you've just introduced a megawatt of fluctuation to that circuit. And so the technical ability to support that much regulation on a circuit may not be realistic. You're all familiar with the financial analyses, so I won't dwell on this, except to look at the end of a deferral period, what do you do with the battery? You can put in the costs to remove it. You can say the battery is junk and write it off, or you can say it's in a mobile container and we'll relocate it to another place and not charge that circuit application with the residual value of the battery. And that's a question that's important. Or you can say we'll leave the battery there and use it for time arbitrage, but we don't need it for reliability now. Okay, more examples just of daily dispatch. If the storage is only dispatching for capacity deferral, it's just those little green sparks on the spikes on the bottom and the right. If it's offered in the reg market, then you get more complicated behavior. If it's being used for charge-discharge, then you get still more complex behavior coming out of the operating strategy. Can talk about that at length but in the interest of time, since you've heard about it, I'll go on. And a key issue in all of this is managing the state of charge at the end of the market day so that it's ready for the next day, including the peak shave primary requirement. Okay, let's take a little time to look at PV smoothing and voltage level control. The big issues with hosting capacity are high voltage from too much PV, too much flicker from the PV variability, and backfeed. Backfeed can often be dealt with by modifying the production, but the high voltage and the flicker are real engineering issues. And so batteries can mitigate this. In order to do this, you need to understand the circuit, be dealing with that planning model, understand the irradiance data that's applicable to the PV on the circuit. Ideally, you'd know things like the orientation of the panels and how much tree cover. Real world, no, you don't know these things. Knowing where the PV is about the best you can hope for. But the idea is to bring the voltage level variation within ANSI standard. In other words, not to bring it to nominal, but to bring it to within 5% of nominal. And so the battery size is related to how much kilovar we need to inject or withdraw to control the circuit voltage at different locations on the circuit. When I talked about time series analysis, if we're managing intermittency, we need to run the analyses down to 10-second intervals. Getting 10-second PV data is often another challenge, but there are solutions around it. But it starts with SCADA data from the utilities, and typically picking high PV production days, low load. And not only are you simulating the circuit behavior and the battery, but the battery controls, because the control design is critical. And this is just, an example showing here's a circuit. We have a battery on the circuit, and it's looking at the rate of change of the PV power and saying if it gets outside a rate of change limit, let's use the battery to charge or discharge and mitigate the amount of injection the PV is putting into the system. So the PV smoothing does not require big batteries, but it requires local, fast, autonomous control because you're just trying to mitigate the rate of change of the voltage so that the flicker is not noticeable and doesn't violate ANSI standard. Okay, voltage control, same story. Bring the voltage to ANSI standard so that you can see the blue charts before, the red is after, and we're keeping the steady state voltage in limit. Let's look at some case studies talking about transmission and distribution applications, real world analyses and case studies that cover the gamut of these applications, including the stacked applications. And I'll talk. So this is the first, and it's close to home. This was last year in Washington. PEPCO, as part of the Capital Grid project, wanted to build a new substation. And that new substation would serve an underground network in, I think it was Northeast Washington in the Union Station area. The driver for the new substation was the existing feeders that served that underground network were going to be inadequate with the new construction going on in the city. In other words, parking garages were being replaced with high-tech office buildings. And so the load would go up, and the 6 feeders that served the network wouldn't be able to carry it when only 5 were in service, which is the reliability standard for the underground network. The stakeholders argued you could avoid building that station by putting batteries in the network. And thousands of hours of analysis went into simulating the network, the feeders, the station, the batteries, and looking at how big the batteries had to be, how they would be operated, and what the economics were. And the economics were strongly against using batteries in this case. And as I told the commission at the time, for 12 years I've advocated for energy storage in front of commissions, Congress, FERC, utilities, but this was a case where the engineering just didn't work. And then add to that the problems of how would you deploy 40 megawatts of storage in a dense urban area. The siting was also a serious concern. And I think you heard from Charlie Vartanian earlier about changes to the fire protection standards around batteries, which just further complicate the siting. Okay, case study in upper New York State, in a semi-rural area in ski country, a bunch of large PV systems to go on a feeder, and one possibility was beef up the distribution with a new feeder. The other was to use batteries to absorb some of that energy and mitigate the peak. And this turned into a rate case filing where the utility could say, look, putting batteries in will be less expensive than building the circuits to accommodate that photovoltaic. Okay, in Southern California, now this was 2 years ago as part of a review of all of the storage pilots in California for the California Energy Commission. And the 40 megawatt battery that's discussed is the Escondido battery, which sat in a substation and was able to defer the need for an additional transformer in the substation. So it was capacity deferral of a substation transformer. And that application is often attractive because transformers are expensive. And what was interesting was the way it was being used in the market for stacked applications when it wasn't needed for capacity deferral. But coming back to the need to do the homework in the state, an outgrowth of the original California mandate was the utilities were basically told each, thou shalt go put in 120 megawatts of storage next year as part of that mandate. And in speaking with the utility engineers, the critical dimension for them was, where can we site it? In order to get it in within a year, we have to find a site that is a non-remediated environmental site that we own and where it's convenient to a substation. And so the economic and the engineering analysis took a back seat to we just have to find out where we can get it in time for the mandate. So I bring that up again as do the homework first. Okay, case study in Northern Illinois for ComEd. This was, I think, 2016. Screened the entire system, 5,000 feeders. How many places would storage be viable? And at the time, the answer was about 76 megawatts, primarily for capacity deferral. If that were redone today, the answer would be different because storage is a lot less expensive and because electrification is on the table, which it wasn't 5 years ago. But if you factor electrification and city goals for electric vehicle and building heating into the picture, then you get enough load growth to say that you need storage. Okay, different case study. This is the Bronzeville microgrid in Chicago, which is unique that it's utility owned, but a lot of the distributed generation will be third party. And it's in a underprivileged community. It's in South Chicago and adjacent to the Illinois Institute of Technology, and the Bronzeville and IIT microgrids will be capable of interconnection and operating as one or two separate under the control of either. So it's kind of unique that way too. But the unique thing here is the utility can own and deploy the storage, and then the PV developers can exploit that storage. And it's a early example of the idea that says utility-owned storage, but available to the consumer or the PV developer for capturing PV energy and then reusing it on peak, can help with the PV adoption, help achieve renewable goals. And because the storage is there as a regulated asset, it's not a cost hurdle to the PV owner. So this one's close to home, as you can see in the map. I wasn't personally involved, so don't hope that I can answer detailed questions. But it was looking at 230 kV congestion in PJM and where can we relieve congestion with batteries. So two key points. Congestion usually occurs after the N-1, after the first contingency. Money is spent every day, 24 hours a day, to avoid the overload in the what-if case. So you're redispatching off economics so that if the overload occurs, you won't have another overload. I mean, if the outage occurs, you won't have another overload. If you can deploy a battery that can respond almost instantaneously to shift the power flows in the event of the outage, you avoid the congestion costs all year, and the battery only has to operate in the event. So it's a very attractive application for storage. The second factor is you don't have to provide a 100% solution. There may be a sweet spot that says solve 75% of the congestion, leave the rest of that cost in the market, and your benefit to cost ratio is very attractive. And so this is a very common application that we get asked to look at. Same thing in the Mid-Continent ISO, same issue, 230 kV congestion. Full mitigation is too expensive. Partial mitigation pencils out. And as a side comment, the sub-transmission space is kind of a gap. Sub-transmission is the same issue, N-1 overload avoidance, but it usually isn't part of the ISO's congestion management and market dispatch because it's below the transmission level. And it's not distribution, but it's where distributed storage can really pay off for the utilities. Same thing down in South America. This is in Colombia. I won't go through it, but same outcomes that say you figure out where and how big the battery should be to relieve congestion. Case study in California, and again, this is sub-transmission. 60 and 115 kV are sub-transmission. They're not modeled in the ISO's security constrained unit commitment. So it's the responsibility of the utility, but generally speaking, the sub-transmission in Southern California, or in the north for that matter, runs up the canyons into the Sierras. And reliability is an issue. Constructing additional paths is expensive, and the batteries can be a great solution for N-1. So this is what I was talking about, saying the benefit to cost ratio can be very attractive for partial solution. So the sweet spot here is at 64 megawatts in the top screen, where the cost spikes and the battery benefit to cost is the greatest. If you made the battery bigger to capture the additional megawatts, the cost benefit ratio decreases and the numbers of hours a year decrease as well. Okay, this one's kind of specialized, and I think that this is South America also. Transient stability is a kind of a West Coast phenomenon in the United States, Rockies and the Western Interconnect, more than the Northeast. But you do see it in the ties to Hydro-Quebec, for instance, as a concern. And because the battery is so fast, it can mitigate the inertial swings that occur immediately after a fault and provide more transient stability margin. And in the West, a lot of the N-1 constraints that impose congestion are transient stability constraints. So it's an attractive application. And as a parenthetical comment, if the mid-Atlantic coast adopts a lot of offshore wind, transient stability will become an issue where it isn't one today because of the lack of inertia that you get with the inverter-based resources. And so the transient stability application of storage will become a concern in PJM. Okay, and related directly to that, when we have a lot of wind in the system, we lose governor response. It's possible to get some synthetic governor response from wind turbines, but it risks breaking the blades, and so the capability is limited. Storage is a great solution to provide synthetic governor response, and also to provide something close to synthetic inertial response. And this is showing graphs that say we can limit the frequency excursion by using a battery to replace the lost inertia and primary governor response. And this means we don't have to redo the protection, or we don't have to worry about subsequent transient or dynamic stability problems. And this is very real today. It's a commercial application. Okay, so final comment for you. Storage that is utility owned but available to photovoltaic resources can be an interesting business model. And think of the gas business where the pipeline has storage up to 30 days for the gas traders. There are gas storage facilities. The trader rents the storage, if you will, but the equity interest in the energy stays with the trader. And the storage in the pipeline is effectively a regulated asset. And that's an interesting model to think about for battery storage. And you can do some homework and say it'll ultimately increase PV adoption because it makes PV economics more attractive, depending upon what the time of use rates and the behind the meter generation rates look like. So conclusions, storage is a non-wires alternative, lots of attractive applications, but you have to do the homework, the engineering homework and the economics homework. Okay, Molly, close to on time. Time for questions.
That's great. It appears that we have 2 questions in the comments. If anybody else wants to type questions in there, they're more than welcome. So one of the first question says, what software are you using for the time series analysis?
Okay, that's a, let me go back up. I could talk for an hour to this slide. The first problem is the time series has got to be cleaned up. So there's some homegrown software that looks for anomalies in the time series data due to outages, due to N-1 rollover, and so on. Got to clean it up. Second, you've got to scale it and adapt it for the load forecast. So you've got load forecasting software in there. Third, ideally, you would be using AMI data to get individual load profiles along a circuit. That is atypical today. Not that many utilities are able to support that. Third, we're then doing the time series analysis of the battery behavior in homegrown software that's running in MATLAB or Python or the equivalent. And we could be controlling the planning software at every time step with that software. Okay, that's a quick answer to that. Love to talk about it at great length.
Last question we have in the chat, and if anybody else wants to put something in, they absolutely should. Regarding end of deferral period, couldn't the period simply be reset, i.e. still don't make the wired investment?
Well, the short answer is yes. The long answer is if the economic analysis said the optimal deferral period is 4 years, then what it's telling you is in year 4, you should make the grid investment because making the battery big enough at that point becomes uneconomic. And in the real world, you will get to the point where you have to make the grid investments. So you should redo deferral analysis every year on an ongoing basis. But at some point, you can't defer it forever. What happens is there isn't enough time left in the day to recharge the battery. We see this in a lot of the analyses that as you move the deferral period out, you can discharge to shave the peak, but there's not enough hours left and energy capacity left to recharge for the next day. And so that's a hard constraint. You can't get around it. Are there other questions or discussions?
I don't see any other questions or discussions. So Ralph, thank you so much. That was good work speeding up and hitting the right time. And it was also a very, very interesting presentation. Dr. Joke, it looks like you're unmuted. Do you need presentation privileges or are you just going to talk?
I will just talk.
All right. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, Howard presented a list of projects, and he mentioned that not all of these projects are resiliency projects. Well, I don't quite agree, because actually all of these are resiliency projects. Either they are community resilience, where the community needs storage as backup, or they're grid resilience. And if you look at it from that point of view, they all become resiliency projects. Anytime you flatten a peak, whether that peak is a 1-second peak or it is a 5-hour peak, you're doing the grid some good. And that's basically why we have been supporting energy storage for the last 20 years or so, because we want to provide resiliency to both communities and to the grid. And that, of course, also goes into balancing renewables so that you do not create bigger peaks than you have before. As an example, Sterling was mentioned in one of the talks. That started as a resiliency project. They were given money by the state of Massachusetts to essentially provide resiliency for the police headquarters. And they were going to put in a 1-megawatt battery. The point is that 1-megawatt battery would have been used as backup maybe once a year, maybe once every 3 years. So we got together with them and we said, look, wouldn't you like to make some money on this? Wouldn't you like to have a payback? And, well, indeed, we knew that they could because we had just done a project in Vermont where we could demonstrate a very handsome payback. So we did the math at Sandia National Laboratory in a computer model, and we showed them not only that they could save money, but exactly on what they could save, how much. And that came up with a 6-year payback. In addition, we put in some extra money, and the project shifted from the appearance of a resiliency project to a project that paid for itself. The thing is that from the state's point of view, from DOE's point of view, and maybe even from the utilities' point of view, we would like to see the grid resilient. But the consumer basically wants to save money. And if you're going to have a project financed, it's easiest if you have the easiest cost-benefit target. And that's what we have done. That's why we have tried in all these projects to demonstrate to the users, whether it's a municipality, utility, or a private owner, that indeed he can profit by it. And from a bigger point of view, we have known that this provides resiliency. This is a strategy that we have followed. Make it attractive, and people will do it. And after I've done this a number of times, it will become commonplace. So it remains to thank people for this webinar. Apparently, a virtual conference works almost as well as an in-person conference, although you do lose a little bit of the personal interaction. But it's worked well, and we have to thank the speakers, we have to thank the listeners, and above all, we have to thank the Maryland Public Service Commission. Thank you, and if we can help you in future, we'll be happy to do so.
Thank you. And I think Chairman Stanek wants to say just a couple words to close us out. So I'll let the Chairman take it away.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Dr. Zhuk. We've learned a lot over the past 4 weeks, and I'm somewhat glad that we did it over a period of 4 separate lectures. There was a lot of information here, a lot more technical than I could have dreamed of, but I appreciate all the presenters, particularly Ralph today and Howard earlier, digesting some of this information. We all know that there's tremendous potential benefits related to storage technologies. And part of the impetus for creating this workshop was because the Commission has a pilot project currently before us, and not coincidentally, we'll be receiving those filings later on this afternoon, and the Commission will look forward to those that will be made by our utilities. But this has been helpful to the Commission staff, to other regulators, to the commissioners of the PSC, and to our friends in Annapolis. So I just want to thank Sandia National Labs, along with PNNL, Quanta, and of course Dr. Zhuk and the DOE Office of Electric Energy Storage Programs. We really do appreciate the time that you put into these presentations and the slide decks that you've created for us over the past 4 weeks. So thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Chairman, thank you, everyone. The recordings will show up on the YouTube channel at the link that's been provided. And with that, class dismissed. Everyone have a great day. Thanks. My pleasure.